The sea takes what it wants, but it couldn't take the Grafton Five. From the deteriorating hull of their schooner to the 300-mile voyage in a walnut shell, this is a clinical look at how discipline defeats the abyss. This is the verdict of the Auckland Islands. You are standing on the edge of the world, where the wind screams at 50 knots and the salt spray stings like needles. Beneath your boots, the basalt rock of Carnley Harbor is slick with kelp and the smell of ancient cold rot. It is January 2nd, 1864. You see the Grafton, a 75-ton schooner, shuddering as the Southern Ocean tears at its hull. The anchor chain, a heavy iron lifeline, groans under the weight of a force 10 gale. Then, a sound like a rifle shot echoes across the bay. The primary link has snapped. Captain Thomas Musgrave promised his crew a fortune in silver ore, a grand ambition that led them into this sub-Antarctic nightmare. They were supposed to be prospectors, men of industry seeking wealth in the veins of the Auckland Islands. Instead, they are now castaways, 300 miles from the nearest human soul. The logistics were sound on paper, but the reality is a jagged reef. The ship is no longer a vessel. It is a wooden tomb, filling with a viscous flow of icy seawater that ruins the remaining 18 months of dry rations. The failure was not one of courage, but of anchorage kinematics. They relied on a single mooring in a bay where the volcanic floor offers no grip, only slippery stone. By midnight, the temperature drops to 4 degrees Celsius, and the crew is forced into a state of extreme deprivation. They scramble ashore with nothing but a few tools and a tattered Bible. You can see the darkness closing in as the last lantern on the Grafton flickers and dies. They are now officially vanished from the maps of the civilized world. 5 men are standing in the freezing rain, watching their only hope for return disintegrate against the rocks. Musgrave knows the maritime law. He knows he is responsible for every soul on this beach. But as the first winter storm settles over the island, a forensic mystery begins to emerge from the wreckage. Why did they find the remains of a second ship just miles away, where every man perished? What secret lay within the Grafton's cabin that allowed these 5 to endure when others fell? The official logbook remains silent. The world thinks a shipwreck is the end. But for the 5 men of the Grafton, it was just a brutal beginning. By January 4th, 1864, they weren't sailors anymore. They were architects of a desperate new reality. Musgrave looked at the wreckage and refused to let the chaos take hold. He established a code of conduct in a place where the law of the sea had literally shattered against the basalt rocks. They hauled heavy beams of silver pine through knee-deep mud to build a shelter they called Epigwaitt. It measured 20 feet by 12, a tiny fortress against the sub-Antarctic gales that never stopped screaming. They didn't just build a shack. They built a schoolhouse for the soul. Musgrave enforced a schedule of prayer, French lessons, and mathematics, because he knew that idleness was the first step toward the hollow hunger. Look at the precision in these cabin floor plans. The logistics of their survival were a masterclass in forensic engineering. They didn't have a forge, so they stripped the copper bolts from the Grafton's deteriorating hull. Francois Raynal, the mate, was the mechanical heart of this operation. He possessed a genius for making something from nothing, a necessity when you are 300 miles from a warm bed. They were kings of a desolate rock, thriving while the map showed only empty gray ocean. View the hand-forged copper tools they left behind. But even kings have to eat, and the Auckland Islands are a cruel host. Their rations were vanishing, leaving them to rely on the dark stains of seal meat and the bitter crunch of island cabbage. The temperature hovered at a constant, numbing 5 degrees Celsius. Every day was a battle against the damp that rots the spirit before it rots the skin. They were living on a knife's edge. But for a moment, they believed they had defied the inevitable. Observe the jagged edges of this salvaged iron pot. Yet, While Musgrave was teaching his crew trigonometry, a shadow was looming on the north end of the same island. The men of the Grafton didn't know it, but they weren't alone in their misery. Another ship had struck the reef, and that crew was descending into a feral nightmare of competition and death. The contrast is chilling. One group maintained a republic, while the others succumbed to the law of the frost. Witness the distance between these two wreck sites on the survey map. The adrenaline of their initial success was a mask for the terror underneath. They had crossed the threshold into the unknown, leaving civilization behind like a discarded coat. They felt invincible because they had built a chimney that drew smoke and a roof that held back the rain. But the Southern Ocean is a patient predator. It was simply waiting for the winter to turn the crimson of their hope into the gray of a tomb. Note the shaky, fading ink in the captain's midwinter entry. They had committed the ultimate act of exploration. They had made a home in the mouth of hell. Musgrave and Raynal were a perfect pair, one providing the discipline and the other the iron will to innovate. It was a triumph of the human spirit, or so it seemed in those first 6 months of isolation. They didn't see the gear failures or the signs of the coming storms. They were too busy being kings to notice the crown was made of ice. Look at the frozen perspective of Carnley Harbor. What remains of Epigwaitt today is just a pile of stones and a haunting silence. But in 1864, it was a beacon of order in a world of chaotic spray. They had survived the wreck, built a republic, and defied the odds. But the island was about to remind them that no man is a king for long in the roaring 40s. The question isn't how they lived, but how long they could keep the darkness at bay. Inspect the weathered grain of this salvaged pine timber. The honeymoon period at Epigwaitt ended when the first sub-Antarctic winter hammered the door down. By May 1864, the humidity was no longer just an annoyance. It was a slow-motion executioner. Rainfall was recorded on nearly 300 days of the year, turning the ground into a black, sucking slurry. The men were trapped in a perpetual state of dampness that chilled the marrow, and then the rations hit zero. Examine the salt-eroded edges of this empty flour tin. The logistics of the hollow hunger are a clinical descent into madness. Musgrave's men were forced to become predators to survive the extreme deprivation. They hunted the massive sea lions, beasts that fought back with a feral intensity. The crew consumed the dark stains of seal liver just to keep the scurvy from loosening their teeth. Every meal was a grim gamble with survival, and the stakes were rising. Trace the heavy impact marks on this primitive stone club. The gear began to fail in ways the manufacturers in Sydney never anticipated. Leather boots, soaked through for months, simply started deteriorating on the men's feet. They were forced to tan-seal skins using nothing but grit and desperation to create makeshift footwear. The wind continued to scream across the cliffs, a force 10 reminder of their total isolation. You can see the fraying fibers of this original sealskin boot remnant found near the hearth. Francois Raynal was a man of cold, hard logic, and he could see the barometer falling. He built a forge from the ruins of the ship, but the fuel was scarce and the air was thin. The pressure of 20 months of silence from the outside world began to crack the discipline. Musgrave kept them busy with lessons, but you can't eat French verbs when the mercury hits zero. Look at the erratic, cramped spacing in this midwinter weather log. A critical blunder was becoming clear. They had focused on the silver mines instead of a fast exit strategy. They had spent their energy building a house when they should have been reinforcing a hull. The technical debt was coming due, and the ocean was the debt collector. They were watching the horizon for a sail that never came, while the iron in their bodies was being sapped by the cold. Observe the deep pit marks of oxidation on this salvaged ship's hinge. The psychological toll was a quiet, viscous flow of despair. 5 men, sharing a 20-foot space, listening to each other breathe in the dark. Every cough was a threat. Every disagreement was a potential mutiny. Musgrave managed to maintain order, but the tension was a physical weight in the room. They were one bad winter away from becoming the lost. Just like the crew on the other side of the island. Study the heavy shadows in this reconstructed interior of the Epigwaitt hut. Then came the realization that changed everything. No one was looking for them. The world had moved on, and the Grafton was just a name in a ledger of missing vessels. The strategic decision was no longer about mining silver. It was about the impossible physics of escape. They had to rebuild the wreckage or wait for the island to reclaim their remains. The trap was shut, and the only way out was through the waves. View the cracked glass of this 19th century nautical compass. The realization hit them like a sub-Antarctic gale. No one was coming. By January 1865, the Grafton was just a skeleton of barnacles and broken dreams. They had been on this rock for a year, and the only thing growing was their desperation. The ship wasn't a vessel anymore. It was a scrap heap. Musgrave and Raynal made a choice that was either brilliant or suicidal. They decided to dismantle their only shelter to build a way out. Examine the heavy, rusted teeth of this cross-cut saw. The technical debt was staggering. They had a tiny dinghy, barely 12 feet long, and they needed to stretch it into something that could survive the Southern Ocean. Raynal was the architect of this impossible task. He built a forge from salvaged stone and bellows from the skins of the very seals that kept them alive. He spent months beating cold iron into shape, his hands cracked and blackened by the soot. Look at the jagged hand-pounded head of this copper fastening. The work was a clinical exercise in human endurance. They had to lengthen the boat by 3 feet using nothing but salvaged planks and iron will. Every nail was a victory. Every seam was a potential grave. The wind never stopped its screaming, a constant reminder that the sea was waiting to reclaim whatever they launched. They were stripping the very walls of Epigwaitt to feed the forge. Observe the charred remains of these structural timber beams from the hut. By June, the boat they named the Rescue was a patchwork of desperation. It was a Frankenstein of maritime engineering, held together by copper bolts and seal oil caulking. They had no dry dock, no engineers, and no margin for error. If the buoyancy calculations were off by even a few degrees, the first wave would be their final curtain. The law of man had ended, and the physics of the abyss took over. Trace the rough, uneven lines of this reconstructed hull planking. The strategic decision was brutal. The boat was too small for all 5 of them. It was a math problem with a viscous flow of guilt. Musgrave, Raynal, and Sullivan would go. 2 men would stay behind and pray that the Rescue didn't become just more floating debris. To be abandoned on that shore, watching your friends disappear into the gray mist, is a horror the journals barely touch. Study the hollow, distant gaze in this sketch of a castaway left behind. They were launching a walnut shell into the most violent water on the planet. 300 miles of white-capped mountains lay between them and Stewart Island. It wasn't a voyage. It was an execution that they had spent a year preparing for. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, heavy dread that sat in the pit of their malnourished stomachs. The Rescue was their only hope, and it was a fragile one. Look at the frayed, salt-caked ends of this original hemp rope. They pushed off into the surf on July 19, 1865. The stone chimney of Epigwaitt stood like a tombstone behind them, a monument to a year of struggle. They were leaving the only solid ground they knew for a liquid desert that had already swallowed their ship. The silence of the island was finally broken by the creak of oars and the roar of the breakers. You can see the desperation in the shaky handwriting of Musgrave's final entry. The snow eventually covers the mistakes, but the journals, they don't lie. By the time Musgrave's patchwork boat crawled onto the shores of Stewart Island, the men were less than human. They were walking skeletons, held together by salt and an iron refusal to die. They had navigated 300 miles of the world's most violent water in a boat held together by seal oil. It shouldn't have worked. The physics say they should be vanished. Look at the salt-etched grain of this original boat plank. But the real forensic tragedy wasn't found in the water. It was found on the north side of the same island. While Musgrave's men maintained a republic, the crew of the Invercauld, wrecked at the same time, succumbed to the dark stains of chaos. 19 men turned into frozen figures because they lacked the one thing the Grafton had, a leader who enforced the law of routine over the law of the abyss. Observe the stark, hollow ruins of the Invercauld's disorganized camp. Musgrave didn't just save his crew. He returned for the 2 men he had left behind. He chartered the Flying Scud and sailed back into the mouth of the storm. He found them alive, still clinging to the stone chimney of Epigwaitt. The legacy of their survival changed the maritime world forever. It forced the governments to build castaway depots, small huts filled with hope for the next soul the sea decided to spit out. Study the official government map of these emergency rescue depots. The cost of their ambition was £3,000 and 20 months of their lives. But the forensic verdict is clear. Nature is a patient predator, but it can be out-engineered by discipline. Musgrave's seal-blood journal remains a masterclass in psychological resilience. It proves that the dark side of exploration isn't always about the fall. Sometimes it's about the refusal to stay down. Inspect the final, clear signature of Thomas Musgrave in the official Sydney archive. We recover these journals from the lost to remind ourselves of the thin line between a survivor and a remains. The Auckland Islands are silent now, the stone huts deteriorating back into the moss. But if you listen to the wind in Carnley Harbor, you can still hear the sound of a hammer hitting a copper bolt. It's the sound of a man refusing to be silent. The sea takes what it wants, but it couldn't take the Grafton 5. Look at the modern monument standing on the desolate cliffside.